Because I think, for the most part, God sees us much differently than what we see ourselves, and way differently, most often, than the people sitting next to us. What does God see? Well, as we continue this journey into living life every day with joy, I think it's important for us to know who we are and what God sees. It's far more important to know what God sees than what we see and what other people see. In fact, I'm going to tell you, and you've heard me say this before, and you've told people this, don't worry so much what other people think about you. Because if you spend all of your time trying to be like other people want you to be, you'll never be the person God's called you to be. It's pretty simple. You see, one of the things that we've been learning is we've been trying to find our way to a more joy-filled life. And let me ask that question again. How many of you still would like to have more joy in your life? Thank you. Well, I'm going to tell you some ways to do that today. And it's really about your decision and your choice. You see, one of the things that I've learned in the last year is that God's more concerned with our character than He is with our comfort. Now, that's not a very comforting word, is it? But it's true. God's more concerned with your holiness. Oh, there's that word again, and we still don't like it. Than He is with your happiness. God's more concerned with you as a person than He is about your possessions. It's about who we are, not what we are. It's about who we are, not what we have. It's about who we are in the eyes of God. See, God's getting you ready. Now, some of you are saying, well, I wish He'd hurry up and get me ready for something. Because you're waiting. Waiting is such hard work, isn't it? But God's getting us ready. God's getting us ready for being everything He's called us to be. And the truth is, all along the journey, we're becoming. From the time we make that first commitment, that first confession that Jesus is the Christ, to the day we die and join Him in heaven, God's getting us ready. And the message today is it's time to get ready. And the way you do that with God is you work on your character. Now, I know some of you have been called a character. Any of you? You're quite a character. That's not exactly what I'm talking about. You see, we live in a world that puts a lot of emphasis on possessions and popularity. We live in a world where we tend to ask how much money or power or influence does a person have. We ask questions about who's in charge and what's going on. Is that person famous? Is there a reason we should follow them? But those aren't the questions that God asks. God asks questions like, is he or she seeking to follow me? God asks questions like, are you holy and righteous? God asks questions like, are they striving to be like Jesus? Are we trying to live life like Jesus lived life? I think sometimes, even in the church, we spend way too much time asking unimportant questions instead of the really good questions, the really godly questions, like, who has God called us to be? Does it matter? I think it matters. I think it matters about the questions we're asking. Because the questions we ask help us see the way to faith, see the way to a joy-filled life, the way to a godly life. I think there's even kind of a formula for this. It's been on Facebook this week, and the formula for this begins with our actions. How many of you have done something today? Y'all are here, so you've all done something, right? Turn to a neighbor and look at them, make sure they're here. All right. So most of you are here. That's good. Those of you still laughing, we'll be just a little concerned about. You see, we all have actions that we do every day. We get up in the morning, we get dressed, we go to work, we go out in the yard, we do whatever it is we do. And my guess is we normally do it the same way every day, day after day after day after day after day, because our actions become habits. And habits are those things that we do day after day without thinking about it. I was driving to church one day. I don't know about you, but I drive to church the same way day after day. But on Thursday, I was driving to church, and a friend of mine called, and so I answered the phone on my car so I didn't have to touch the cell phone. And we got to talking, and I missed the turn. Now, none of you have ever done anything like that, right? Good. I'm glad that none of you have this issue. So I'm still driving down the road. I finish the phone call, and I look up, and I go, why am I here? We missed the habit. The habit got disrupted. Now, habits, when we do them over and over and over again, become ultimately our character. And it's our character that we want to talk about today, and about how we get to that point. And Jesus really does give us, and Paul gives us, some good clues on how to develop a Christian character. I'm almost afraid to call it that. Because as soon as I said Christian character, people thought, well, that's somebody who has no fun and has no... You all get it, right? Because we're going to talk about being holy and how all of us are called to be holy, and we all go, but I'm not holy. Yes, you are holy. You have been called and set aside by God as His child. And that makes you holy. Now, how you live that holiness out is where all of the character comes into play. So I want you to spend a minute with me thinking about all of the habits that have created your character. Are you selfish or giving? Are you timely or not? Are you compassionate and care about others or focus on yourself. You see, one of the things that I've learned is that God has called us to live with some pretty specific characteristics as His followers. For example, the first one I would call attention to is to live life with compassion. Now, compassion is where we care for other people as much or more than we care for ourselves. Do we care about the people whose lives are falling apart? Do we care about people who are hungry or thirsty or naked or hurting in some other way? Do we care enough? You see, because we can all say we care, but compassion is when we care enough to do something about it. And when we act with compassion, whether it be in our job or in our family life or in our schooling, then we're developing a Christ-like characteristic. But when we act not with compassion, when we take steps that show we don't really care about the other person, then our characteristic is falling short. Now, there's another characteristic that I think Paul talks about, and that's the characteristic of consistency. Now, have you ever made pudding that turned out lumpy? None of you have ever done anything like that. It's not very good. It's not the way you want your pudding to be. I had a taste last night of some of the very best, and I mean I had a taste about this much of what I think may be the best banana pudding I've ever had. There wasn't a single lump except for the tiny bit of vanilla wafer. Had there been lumps other than bananas? Not good. Consistency, though, for humans is being able to be counted on. Consistency for us in the church is being able to say, we are there for people every time. You all know about consistency, don't you? God's looking for people who aren't afraid to be also different than the world around them. You see, because the world tends to leave people in a lurch. Oh, you need help. Well, I don't know what I can do. It was very interesting. On Friday morning, I'd woken up. I was getting the house cleaned up and ready for more stuff. Thank you. I was getting ready for family. And the phone rings. It wasn't anybody I knew. But I answered the phone. It was my day off. I had a list of about 20 things to do. But it was someone who had been referred to me because they needed help with an electric bill. I was really tempted to say, call the office. Call Duncanville Outreach. Call anyone other than me. But I didn't. I put them on hold, and I made a couple of phone calls, and I found a way to help them. don't think most of the world would do that. Now, I think most of us in this church would do that. We would do everything we could, but quite frankly, those of us in the church are far outnumbered by those outside the church. And society doesn't tend to take care of itself very well. How consistent are we in living life out of our faith? The third thing I think that Paul talks about here is the idea of cooperation, and you saw a great example of that. God's looking for people who put cooperation ahead of competition. Paul's one of the most gifted men in the history of the church. And I have to tell you that as I read his writings, he was just a tad bit competitive. But he also knew that if we work together, we'll accomplish a whole lot more than we would if we do things all on our own. And then there's commitment. It's always tough to talk about commitment. I read an article this week that said normal church attendance of active church members is dropping. 10 years ago, normal church attendance for active church members was 3 out of 4 Sundays. About 5 years ago, we noticed that there was a trend, and it was 2 out of 3, 2 or 3 Sundays out of 4. And it's almost down to 2 Sundays a month. Now, there's lots of reasons for that. They aren't leaving the church. People aren't leaving the church, but their lives are busy. Or at least that's what they're saying. A good friend of mine was on Facebook before God this morning. And you have to understand, she's not a morning person, but she has kids. So I typed to her, "Why are you up so early?" She said, "Because Noah, her second to oldest son, had a baseball tournament that started at 8 o'clock on Sunday morning." We live in a different world. We live in a world that isn't concerned about being nice to the church. We live in a world that isn't committed to Jesus, so why should they be committed to the church? Things are changing. Johnny and Mary Almanza just came back from the General Assembly, and one of the messages that they got there is, things are changing. And the church better change with it. The church needs to be changing, or else we're going to be irrelevant. Now, the good news is, and this is really good news, ever since the conception of the church in Acts chapter 2, that's been true. The world continues to change. And if the church is going to be relevant, we have to change too. Now that makes us really nervous. But there are some things that don't have to change. Our faith doesn't change. Scripture's instruction doesn't change. God's command for us to love one another, to love the world, to love the people around us doesn't change. But maybe how we do it does. I've always been amazed at people who can stay married to the same person for 60 years. How many of you have been married for 60 years? I know some in this room have been or were. One more year? Well, have you all done any changing, Ted, in 60 years? Thank you. It's true, isn't it? In our commitment, we have to be ready for some change. That's one of the things that Paul's telling us. And then the last thing he says in the last verse is, have some courage. Courage is hard. You know, courage is easy when there's no trial. Courage is easy when there's no question. Courage is easy when there's no conflict. But as soon as there's conflict, as soon as something stands up, courage sometimes becomes hard to find. We don't want to stand up to people. We don't want to stand up for our faith. We don't want to stand in the way because we're afraid. Paul's describing Epaphroditus, one of his co-workers, at the end of this text. And he says, be brave like Epaphroditus, willing to take a risk, willing to step out in faith. You know, one of the things that I've long believed is that the church is one of the greatest sleeping giants our world has ever known. Even though this church is shrinking in America, there's still millions and millions of people gathering to worship and praise. There are millions of people gathering together out of faith. And we've been called. We've been called to change some of our actions and some of our habits so that we can create more Christ-like characteristics. Now, how do you do that? You practice. Noah, the young man going to the baseball game with my friend Sylvia this morning, is a picture. And he's really good. I mean, really good. He throws about an 84-mile-an-hour fastball, and he's not very old. He can make it curve. He can make it miss the other guy's bat. How did he get to be that good? He practiced. Well, how do we get good at our Christ-like character? We need to practice. We need to practice praying. We need to practice our Bible reading. We need to practice our acts of compassion. We need to do them over and over and over and over and over again so that our lives are ingrained with our faith, not with our fear. We need, as was said when I was in high school so often, to walk the walk and talk the talk. We need to step out and over the lines that our society has drawn and said, no, the church is over here. Because God has called us to infiltrate every part of our world. There were two things I loved about last Sunday. About the sermon, they stepped out in faith when common sense said there wasn't enough money. You know, when Pioneer Bible Translators decided to grow, they didn't have the money to do it. And no clue really where it was going to come from. And so they prayed. But they didn't just pray. They prayed for specific things, and they prayed for big things, and then they prayed for bigger things. But even that wasn't enough, because they knew that even in their prayers, they had to live life like it was going to be different. They needed to live life looking for translators and looking for staff and looking for people. And that's the same for us in the church. We need to pray bigger prayers, more specific prayers, more vital prayers, and more prayers more often. But we need to be looking how to be answers to those prayers as well. And we need to practice them. Because when we start living life with God's characteristics in our lives, our world's going to change. And one of the things that's going to happen is we're going to be able to say, I'm feeling more joy. Because when more people come to Jesus, we'll be happier. When more people's lives are changed and we've had our hand in the midst of it, we'll be happier. When we work together as a church and as a team and create opportunity for lives to be changed, we'll all be happier. There will be more joy. So we need to work on these characteristics. We need to live life with compassion and consistency and cooperation and commitment and courage. Because when we do, joy shows up.